On this episode, I am joined by a lot of my coworkers, actually. John Lucchese, Scott Schefferman. We are welcoming Yuriy Bulygin, founder and CEO here at Eclypsium, to discuss protecting the digital supply chain. Stay tuned. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Welcome, everyone, to Below the Surface, the Firmware and Supply Chain podcast. This is episode number 17. I am joined by Mr. Scott Schefferman. Scott, welcome.
Hello, hello. Greetings from Honolulu. Aloha, I should say.
Very nice. Glad you could join us. Mr. John Lucchese has joined us. John, welcome.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, before we get into it, just a quick announcement. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclypsium by visiting eclypsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risks, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that at eclypsium.com/go. Yuriy, welcome to the show today. How are you?
Hey, Paul. Glad to be here.
Yes.
It's
nice to have you here on the podcast, and I think it's almost a rare treat that all of us are representing Eclypsium on the show today. And I'm excited to hear from you, Yuriy, and have a discussion about, really what embodies what we all do here at Eclypsium is help protect the digital supply chain. So I want to start, Yuriy, just talking about the challenges that all of us face protecting the supply chain. And I'll leave that open-ended so you can kind of define the various types of supply chains and one specifically that we're working to protect.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. That's a dear topic for me and for all of us here. Ultimately, we started with this idea that we don't really know what we're buying in terms of digital products, because we're all part of the global supply chain, and the products that we buy, whether it's software or hardware products like those laptops, they're built by so many companies, so many teams. They have so many components inside, and by the time we're getting those products, the hardware that we put in our infrastructure or software that runs our applications, those are black boxes. We don't know about them much. And I have this laptop that I'm speaking through. It has close to 40 different components, from this web camera to the chipset and the CPU and all the firmware in it. And how do I know what's in it? How do I know that it hasn't been altered by anyone or infected or what sort of vulnerabilities there? I think that's the core kind of a issue that we have, and the more we move to this state of using a lot more products, the more and more unknown risk from that supply chain that we're bringing into our organizations, and that's something that we wanted to solve, and we want to solve now as a company and building products, building capabilities that help our customers solve that.
It's interesting, Yuriy. I think that when we look at like computer nerds, we feel like we're in tune with the hardware, right? Like I was just working with a computer and I was looking at the RAM and I'm like, is it compatible? I'm looking down to that level, but I'm like, that doesn't really scratch the surface of a supply chain problem. Even though I may know that there's different components on there and I'm trying to find compatibility with something like RAM, I don't really know what chips are on there, where they come from, and what was delivered to me on those chips, right? And that's really the heart of the problem, even if you're close to the hardware and firmware.
Oh, yes, and worse. I was just a couple of days ago I was looking at because I wanted an example of a typical laptop or desktop that is pretty popular. And I was looking at the HP Pavilion 550. It blew my mind that the HP Pavilion 550 desktop has 4,668 modals. That each modal is a combination of different components in it, different motherboards. There are about 4 different types of motherboards that Pavilion 550 is using, and then all of those 20 components. We're not even going into versions of these components, what they run inside, what sort of OS they run inside, network card, or what sort of firmware they run inside motherboard, or manage some kind of a management controller or camera or SSD or whatever. We're not even going into that space. Just different modifications of and configurations of components and different types of motherboards create this huge space of modals for one type of a desktop. This is the complexity, that we're dealing with when we're buying all that, all of that hardware, all of that software. I was reading one of the reports by the Government Accountability Office, and they did the analysis of a supply chain for one of the PC manufacturers, and turned out that PC manufacturer has 65 direct suppliers and more than 200 subordinate suppliers that build components into systems of that manufacturer, that develop code that runs in those systems. So the complexity of that is amazing. It is incredible, and because of that complexity, because all of that software that all those suppliers develop has vulnerabilities. All that complexity brings a lot of risk.
Yeah. Well, it also, I think what we're saying too, Yuri, is it's in a larger attack surface, in a threat landscape that hides below the surface, right? Is really when we come to this point in the show, that's what we want you to take away, that all this stuff exists, but it exists as an attack surface.
Yeah, it all adds to the attack surface that we don't really see much. Yes. We don't really have a lot of visibility into, and we don't really have a lot of intelligence and information about, and tools to poke around it and see how vulnerable, how bad it is.
Yuri, I mean, we just talked about the vulnerabilities, but then there's also the notion that there can also be threats coming directly from that supply chain in the current global context that we're in right now. I'm at FCA West out here in Hawaii, listening to all sorts of folks from DoD and intelligence and everything else, and they're genuinely concerned and almost to the point of freaking out. I mean, there's major talks being delivered to thousands of people out here. And supply chain is key amongst the topics because they're worried about just raw threats coming from the supply chain at this stage as well.
Thanks, Scott. And yes, we at the government level, I think at national level, we've been dealing with those type of threats for over a decade now, because the nation state sponsored actors have been exploiting supply chain and have been exploiting vulnerabilities at those levels in critical equipment for a while. In components of critical equipment, hard drives and baseboard management controllers and the BIOS, UEFI, all of that. Now, I think the huge shift is that almost every threat actor, including most of the ransomware groups today, they target vulnerabilities at that level. I was reading a report by Palo Alto recently, by the Unit 42 Palo Alto, that 48% of all the ransomware attacks are now exploiting vulnerabilities, which is a huge change compared to the last few years when most of the ransomware infections were done through phishing campaigns or spear phishing campaigns. Now it's 48%. The top vector are exploiting vulnerabilities. Akamai also published the same that most of the ransomware actors are building, the exploitation, the vulnerability exploitation capabilities, and a lot of these are in the code developed by the vendors of critical equipment that we're using. And all of these are in appliances from Cisco and Fortinet and Citrix NetScaler and F5 big AP load balancers and so on and so forth. Right now, as we speak, I think there's a pretty active exploitation happening, leveraging Citrix bleed vulnerability in NetScaler ADC and gateways. So it's no longer a nation state playing field. It's a commonplace everyday exploitation for most of the threat actors.
One of the interesting questions or statements that I get, Yuriy, when we talk about this topic of when you acquire technology, that it could come to you with vulnerabilities, known bad configurations, and introduce supply chain issues or threats into your environment. Some folks will say, well, when I buy something, shouldn't it be secure? Shouldn't it not have issues with the supply chain? Isn't it their problem to make sure the supply chain is clean, right up to the point where it gets to me? How do you deal with that kind of objection almost?
Yeah, I think this is everyone's problem. I think that the modern kind of a cybersecurity risk is in large part, at least, is the supply chain security risk, and it's everyone's problem. I think we as developers of technology, software, hardware, we have to deal with with the vulnerabilities in our products, absolutely. And I think that's a big part of what the U.S. government is doing through this year's cybersecurity strategy, and the executive orders on kind of a shifting responsibility across both the developers, vendors, and not just from the end users of the technology. But at the same time, at the end of the day, how do we validate that the vendors do what we need them to do? And in the past, it was the way it was handled is through third-party risk management, essentially questionnaires of hundreds of questions. I don't think that's sustainable, or I don't think that's effective in any way today in the modern supply chain world. So there have to be some kind of capabilities that would allow us independently verify that our suppliers, our vendors who build technology that we rely on in our infrastructure, do all the right things and mitigate all the risks, or not all, but mitigate the risks that we need them to. So I think from that perspective, in order for us as organizations to not be impacted by someone else's vulnerability that someone else introduced in their products that we're using, we have to have an independent capability to validate those, verify those products. Kind of like the trust by verify model, right? We want to trust our suppliers that they do the right things, but we also need to have an ability to verify that.
Go ahead, John.
Sorry. I find that sometimes people get stuck on one or the other of those things. And I think the idea of trust but verify is a good one for all the stuff that we're seeing, because what you actually, even as nerds, when we get exposed to the complexity of all the stuff below the surface, it's usually when something went wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're digging into it, and that's why we figure it out. And I guess what makes us nerds is that we're the ones who do it, and everybody else finds a nerd to do it. We have seen enough of that sort of thing where we know that there's a problem here somewhere, but the only time you wrestle with it is when it's already broken. And I think that's what people are sort of being unhappy with, right? If you look at back to the executive order and some of the things that the U.S. government's been doing, it seems to be two-pronged. One is on the development side, get those people who make stuff to make it better. Cool, but if that's all by itself, it's not enough. You'll never get there. But if you also add the ability to check and update and keep up with whatever happens in the future, you sort of have that trust but verify approach. Now you can actually back up both sides of the supply chain.
Sometimes people will pose this line of questioning to me, and I want to get your thoughts on it, Yuriy. And that is like it's basically, why should I care, right? Like what's the impact if I don't pay attention to these supply chain threats?
I think we saw what can happen, with thousands of organizations getting compromised because of a breach in the supply chain, or a vulnerability in the major components, like the Apache Log4j, and so much exploitation that was happening, using that vulnerability. Right now with Citrix Bleed, there are plenty of examples in the last year or so, or last couple of years, I think. But if I make an analogy here, if we would completely blindly trust the food manufacturers or our food supply chain to do all the right things without really having an ability to really validate what sort of ingredients are in that food that we are eating, consuming, I don't know. It would be a very dangerous world to live in my opinion. So we have to have some kind of ability to really validate what sort of ingredients the food manufacturing industry puts in it, that we eat, and maybe we don't have the easy way to some kind of toolkit that allows us to do the real-time assessment of ingredients in the food. So we have to trust, independent third party, maybe FDA, maybe some other, testing labs that would actually do the testing of those ingredients. But for digital technology, for digital products, we can. We're, advanced enough industry to build those capabilities that would allow anyone to really look at what is inside that particular software product, what is inside that particular hardware product or hardware device, what sort of ingredients there, and what sort of problems it has, potential problems it has, and risks it brings to us. So we're advanced enough to have those, that information, that insight, and those tools. So I think that's kind of we can solve that problem in the digital supply chain a little bit better than in the food supply chain.
Sure.
Can I use that analogy and take it further to make the point, to answer the question of why should we care? Because in the food analogy, if you get something that's bad and has some kind of toxin or poison, you might die, or at least go to the hospital. Let's just be real, all right? And that's not really acceptable for health and humanity, which is why we have the FDA doing their best to measure our food. In the digital supply chain, I think a lot of people think of these kinds of vulnerabilities that, should they be exploited, they might be one-off or esoteric or local only. And we have these notions of threats that deal with devices and firmware as kind of that myopic vision of what those threats actually are in terms of impact potential, right? To use the same food analogy of killing someone by accident, right? A lot of these vulnerabilities that we're starting to uncover, like the ones with BMCs, those can cause, certainly material impact. And we're seeing that, like Yuriy said, with ransomware victims, hundreds and hundreds of them getting class action lawsuits and having certain material impact and having to report via the SEC, via AK forms, stuff that's affecting their operations and their profits, right? But there are also cases where we're finding vulnerabilities that you can bring down, let's say, entire data centers indefinitely in a catastrophic way that puts the data center pretty much out of business. And I don't think people realize the kind of the gravity of the potential for supply chain threats that, you have one vulnerability at the top of the supply chain that ends up in hundreds of thousands or millions of servers worldwide. And should those be wormed or should those be exploited en masse, which are now the level of tooling in modern, threat actors allows you to do that. I think we need to wake up and say, this is not the same world that we were implicitly trusting 5 or 10 years ago. Like Yuriy said, the last year or two has shown us emphatically via vulns and also impact scenarios that we have a real problem on our hand, not just a theoretical or esoteric problem.
I also think that one thing that's bothered me a lot about this sort of issue is the helplessness that you end up feeling when you discover that there's something wrong and you had no visibility into it and there's not much you could do about it. And if you think back to the labeling on foods, we have a lot of the nutritional labeling. That's what empowers you to know what food has something in it or doesn't have something in it. If you are learning and trying to handle, maybe you're intolerant to some ingredients, this is the sort of thing that you need in order to take power and do something about it yourself. And I think that's kind of the same thing in technology here, except there is no nutrition label. And that's kind of what I think we're trying to solve.
Mm.
Stretching that example, when we buy a PC or a server, a new one, there's typically at least a year-old firmware in it. So imagine that we went to the store, grocery store, and bought some favorite food that was a year old. Clearly, that's not acceptable. But why should buying a year-old code or software code in a critical piece of equipment be acceptable?
I think a year is also pretty generous too. I find that software is much older than a year, and when we look inside some of these things,
for new ones on off the shelf, I mean the stuff we're using in the field that years old usually, because we don't most of the folks don't really patch network devices, appliances, and or servers, especially not at the firmware level. So those are years old, for sure.
I got to continue this food analogy. This is just brilliant because you also have things like recalls, or you find out that Skittles has been causing cancer for the last 30 years, and we've all eaten so many Skittles. And then you have a recall. So if you pull something off the shelf, you know where it lives in inventory and supply chain, right, on the shelves of stores. But in the digital supply chain, if there's a recall, if there's a super vulnerable component that can bring down an operation or critical device, an organization, like John said, feels helpless because, okay, that's a subcomponent. I don't know where that lives in my supply chain. Which servers have it? Which ones don't? Which ones are critical? Which ones aren't? How do I action? How do I prioritize? How do I even see or find those components that have been shown to be, CVSS score 9.8 and above, remote code execution type of vulnerability? And I don't even know where those components live, right? So the food analogy, I think, is really rocking here.
Also, it spoils. Code totally spoils, just like food.
It's true. Well, there was folks that made the analogy that open source code is more like a head of lettuce, right, than a rock, right? When I did some interviews with folks, they used different analogies, but we'll talk about open source for a moment. It's kind of like a rock that I pick up and I use to build my wall, and it doesn't come with any warranty or anything like that. Anyone can pick up the rock and use it in their wall, similar to open source components. It's also been described to me as it's less like a rock and more like a head of lettuce, because eventually it's going to expire and go bad, right?
Eventually might be like in a couple days, too.
Yes.
I think Log4j library was a pretty good example because it's so pervasive, and we think about it that it's open source project and open source component, that it's only used in applications or kind of a software products. But the reality is, because it's an open source project, that everybody's using it. The software is everywhere. It's so ubiquitous. It's in every piece of a device. It's in every component. It's everywhere now. And that Log4j was used in a bunch of software products and apps, but it also was used in a bunch of devices, network devices, IoT devices, the wireless access points, and so on and so forth. So just understanding the exposure, this particular vulnerability being exploited in one particular third-party open source component, just understanding the exposure to that vulnerability in your infrastructure, from software applications to hardware devices and systems. It's a massive problem that we have.
We certainly have a visibility issue and problem when it comes to supply chain, but we also, I think, have to talk about the way in which supply chain threats, if you will, undermine or get around any protections that we have in place. Oftentimes, it's interesting. We can talk about it in the context of hardware and firmware, but we can also talk about in the context of software as well. That many of these attacks, Yuriy, right? They are circumventing much of our traditional controls.
Isn't that what was so insidious about Log4j?
Yeah, and SolarWinds, right? And Move It and
SolarWinds.
Yeah.
And BMC chips, AMI. I mean, name a firmware component, it's usually at a pretty low enough level. Even a hard drive controller with running DMA, direct memory access, subverts the CPU, and your whole security stack needs the CPU to even have visibility. UEFI attacks, the network stack on a UEFI is not logged to the kernel. Mm-hmm. And so if your security stack is relying on the OS kernel, it's not going to see that stack, right? So we almost always have this problem with firmware.
That's a scary notion for me, Yuriy, that these attacks do get around our more traditional defenses that we have in security architecture.
I think fundamentally, just going back to what I was saying before, that today, and I'm sure you've heard this phrase, software is eating the world. Software is eating hardware, or has eaten hardware already, because there's no purely hardware. It's all softish. It all runs, different operating systems, different different software architectures, and all of the components that it has. But if we look at different kinds of software, maybe application software compromised because of a vulnerability in one of the components, and that is used by this application, exposes data that this application has access to or uses, that may or may not have a significant impact. But then if you go down in the stack, the technology stack, and if you start exploiting vulnerabilities in a software that is running at a higher level of privileges, maybe a hypervisor, vulnerability in a ESXi, which are being exploited by a number of ransomware groups today, that affects all the workloads, all the virtual machines that are running on ESXi servers, and exposes all the data in those virtual machines. And there could be 200 workloads running on an ESXi server at any given time. And then you go down into in the levels of this technology stack, and you start exploiting some third-party component, maybe open source, maybe closed source, developed by one of the suppliers, in bootloaders, the physical machine OS, the firmware in maybe the UEFI or the BIOS, or one of the chips, one of the major components on that server, then you're getting a lot more privileges. You're getting a lot more access to the data. You're getting a lot more potentially impact on by exploiting that that vulnerability. You're exposing a lot more data handled on that server or network appliance or any other device. And also you're getting a lot more capabilities to subvert security controls, because a lot of security controls are built on top of it, and in higher levels of the stack. And because you're exploiting something that is underneath those security controls, then you can bypass them and subvert. So the lower you go into the infrastructure levels, into the fundamental levels of software and the IT infrastructure, the more impact you can have as an adversary, as an attacker, the more capabilities you are gaining to subvert security and expose data and do more damage.
And I think you summed it up very nicely. But I also add persistence as well. Is a capability that supply chain attacks afford a certain luxury to, right? Attackers being persistent.
That too.
Interesting.
Vulnerability in a container, you restarted the container or exploitation of the vulnerability in container. You restarted the container and your exploit is gone, until it's exploited again. But then a vulnerability in some kind of a firmware that is baked into the motherboard, sitting on the persistent storage like SPI chip. You can reinstall the OS, you can reimage the machine, you can change the hard drive. It doesn't matter. It's still there. It will continue infecting the entire software stack next time it boots.
What about destruction, Yuri?
Scott, just like you mentioned, and I think researchers at Eclypsium, our team, and other researchers, we've showed it so many times that you can remotely exploit a vulnerability in some kind of a BMC that is exposed to a network that runs a Linux-based stack that is exploitable by 29 letters A, and you can literally physically damage that server remotely. As one example, there are so many more examples of that. So I think the lower the stack, the lower the software in the stack, the more ability to do the physical damage.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Even, I mean, the physical damage is possible. It's funny, that research paper came out that talked about a specific use case in set of vulnerabilities for that I mentioned in my talk earlier this year at ShmooCon. But also, Vlad really had a very impactful story, and I was speaking to someone else today, works for federal government, and I was explaining to her this, where if an attacker gets on the BMC and can implant code that just causes it to infinitely reboot, which was one of Vlad's attacks that he described, actually, I believe it was the last episode or one before that on this podcast. If you could do that, you can't take a screen and a keyboard and go fix that, because it's happening before the computer system is making the screen and keyboard available to you, because it's happening at the BMC level. And you can see like the light bulb and just like sheer like panic when people have these realizations that these are the types of attacks that are possible when you go kind of lower down the stack.
Yuri, too, I want to ask you, so I'm out here again at FCA, mostly DoD kind of people out here. And one of the things that I'm hearing when I bring up things like, supply chain attacks, that they're genuinely worried about as the DoD shifts heavy towards AI and heavy compute, is the data ability to manipulate data, to impact the integrity of the data. So, not just persistence, not destruction, not access and confidentiality, but in this case, the integrity of data being processed at high power compute AI workloads. And I think I'm not sure that our audience would understand that when you have certain firmware persistence or access, that would afford you also access to memory and potentially the ability to modify data, runtime data or stored data. Is that correct?
Scott, that's a great question. Right now we're definitely in the era of running a lot of external models, Gen AI models, and training them to solve real society issues. Yes, the model can be tampered with. and the data can be tampered with that this model is trained on. But that model also runs on infrastructure. That model runs on some kind of a hardware, some kind of a either cloud or physical infrastructure or a mix of those. And if that infrastructure is not trustworthy and potentially altered, that can have a significant impact on the model itself and the data it's trained on and the results of that model. Just like GPU cards, they have microcode, they have firmware, and modifying that can potentially impact the models that are trained on those GPU cards.
Yeah, the conversation I was having with one gentleman was, if even just 1 0 gets flipped to a 1, it doesn't have to be a well thought out strategic, data poisoning kind of anti-ML attack. It could actually just be very subtle modifications, and even just one instance of that. They're even worried about solar flares in this regard, because when the DoD uses AI, their models have to be so precise, because you're dealing with life and death, you're dealing with accuracy and timing and reliability. So they're even worried about a single 0 or 1, even just organic corruption, if you will, at the CPU level during these AI compute kind of processes. So I can't imagine what an actor would do who had long-term persistence and the ability to corrupt or affect data over time. That'd be a pretty bad scenario.
So, like, from a security architect perspective, you're oftentimes developing something that has layers of defenses and has various types of defenses. You might worry about particular mechanisms, but one of the things that you end up usually just accepting is that the stuff that you have that you're depending on, maybe I can run some tests on it, maybe I can see that it's right, but the stuff inside it is hopefully right. This is where you end up trusting that vendor again, or trusting that third party. One of the things that I think is changing is our tolerance for that and our ability to do something about it. Certainly for a long time, we really haven't had any chance to do anything about it. And I think that's what's changing here. We're now at a point where we know enough to know that's not good enough. So we can do something about it by getting more visibility. And kind of going back to that whole analogy on food, maybe we want to change our diet.
But how do we know what's healthy for us and not healthy for us if there was only some sort of guide that could tell us what is good and what is not so good for us in a digital supply chain? And we're all laughing here on the show because this is the new product that we recently announced called the guide. Well, I'll let Yuri talk about it, but it is our new product. I'm excited about it.
I see what you did here.
You like that?
Absolutely, yes. Well, I think that, fundamentally, when we started Eclypsium, we started gathering a lot of data about the suppliers and different systems and PCs and servers, and then later on expanded into gathering a lot of data about the network, appliances, devices, and more. And at some point we've been using that data internally in our platform for our customers to really start kind of interrogating those devices and comparing to known good, and scanning those firmware images in those devices for vulnerabilities or potentially implants, backdoors. But sometime about a year ago, we thought, okay, why don't we make that data available directly to our customers, to the industry, because maybe they don't want to actively monitor the parts of infrastructure, but they do want to understand their exposure. They do want to understand that the products that they buy, those PCs that they buy, or network devices that they buy, understand their risk and compare that risk and maybe have a risk-based informed decisions when they when they purchase those products and decide to use in production. And I think that at that point, kind of the idea of this, data supply chain risk intelligence system emerged. And yesterday we announced the product that we call Eclypsium Guides to Supply Chain Security, because it's a universal catalog of knowledge and wisdom about the supply chain. Just like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is the universal catalog of knowledge and wisdom about the universe. So we just announced that product and made it available for early access. And what ultimately it has is all of this kind of intelligence data that we've been collecting about external products and components and about their risk, supply chain risk, in a way that allows users to compare those products, find the products that are impacted by vulnerabilities in some of the components that they use, or potentially trace components or suppliers that have been compromised, have been altered, that may impact systems and products that we use in the infrastructure.
I love this as a scalable mechanism, and I hadn't considered it till just now. But when I or any of us on the research team that work here at Eclypsium, we find something that's bad, right? We've looked under the covers of something, and then we write about it in the blog or we present it at a conference. It begs people to ask questions of like, I'm not going to buy that thing, but I'm going to buy this other thing. And have you looked at the firmware, Paul or John, like any of us, right? Have you looked at this one? And with so many products out there, I'm like, I can't personally look at everything. And this has been a trend every time we publish something like, hey, we looked at this thing and we found some really bad things. So I love the guide as this scalable resource where people can ask those questions of what's the level of trustworthiness I should have on these devices that I'm looking at buying?
So a while back when I was supporting DoD, and you have these multi-billion-dollar programs that have all sorts of software and vendors, the way that we had to do it, right, in the absence of something like the Hitchhiker's Guide, or the Guide, as we're calling our new release, is we had to sit in a room with some men in black suits from certain agencies and go down literally line by line across thousands of vendors and look at their provenance, look at where they get their money, look at who their developers are and what their nationalities are. And if there was any past issues that would be flagged too, like if we had found something bad over there, then we knew we shouldn't use it over here. And that was literally the extent and best effort possible to look at or even question the supply chain that should support a multi-billion-dollar weapons program or satellite program or submarine program or whatever it is. And the conversations I had today, I got to like try on talking about the guide with various commanders and things like that from the Navy, and their eyes are just wide open. Wait, you could look, if I gave you all of my device inventory, makes and models, just even start with something as basic as that, which any enterprise or a mission needs to kind of have just as part of inventory management, device, technology refresh. Then you can take that data set and compare it to what Yuri's describing in terms of the known universe of good and bad and vulnerable and provenance as well is inferred in that. You could actually understand for the first time across all of your whole program or mission what your exposure is relative to zero. Because right now your implicit assumption going in is that I'm trusting everything. And I don't think there's a single vulnerability in any of it that I need to worry about. You're literally you're forced to make that operational decision. And then if you insert the guide in that and show contrast and say, no, I actually have 60% of those makes and models that have these three, Cat 1 or high CVSS score vulnerabilities. Now I have the ability to finally understand mission risk and say, I'm going to accept that risk for X, Y, and Z reasons, operational cadence, budget. There's a lot of reasons why you might have to accept the risk, but at least you know the risk. And what the DoD is dealing with now is not mutually assured destruction. They're dealing with mutually unassured destruction. They're not sure when they hit the button that it's going to do the damn thing. And that's true of our enemies in the DoD, but also ourselves. And so I think the DoD right now is scrambling to be able to assure that the supply chain can actually support the mission when called upon to do, when it matters most. And so I had tremendous conversations about the guide in the last couple of days here, and it's because of that dynamic that Yuriy and Paul, you just mentioned, the scalability and lack of friction, because you don't have to do anything operationally. That's hard to do in the DoD, right? It takes a long time and a lot of coordination. But if you just give me the data set and I can tell you back what your exposure is, that's really powerful.
So Scott, that's interesting, and then you definitely went to the existential spot there. So that means I'm going to take you to the opposite end of the spectrum and be completely silly. So what you're saying is there's this very large military organization. Let's suppose it's it's a sci-fi thing, and maybe they're in space, right? And in space, they're building like the ultimate battle station, this huge, sort of like a moon, but it's not a moon, it's a space station kind of thing. And let's suppose that a lot of work went into it. It was being built over many years. It's probably behind schedule. But in any case, it's made up of all these components. And there's just one little component that has this astronomical risk. You think that there could maybe be that sort of application to this, Scott?
Like an exhaust port?
Like an exhaust port in, large battle
empire.
Maybe if there was an empire.
And that's literally part of the value of the guide, bringing it back to like Enterprise versus Star Wars or any other kind of analogy, bring it back to brass tacks. A lot of times you learn about something like Log4j or a campaign that's rolling out and hitting Citrix NetScaler right now, right? And in that case, you know what your Citrix devices are. But when you're dealing with an upstream component that might be all over your enterprise, but you don't know either way as you sit here, it's really hard to action that. And I can imagine the board reading about a Wall Street Journal article about a new campaign that's rolling out that's hitting certain verticals. And the board goes to the CISO or to the risk management team and says, what's our exposure to this thing I just read about? And you can't answer that mail today unless you have the guide.
Hold on, Yuriy?
So I think this is very fundamental. And Scott, what you mentioned, and I love John's example, but hold on, let's deal with the IT problems first before we deal with the space infrastructure problems. But Scott, I think what you mentioned is like it's very fundamental question. When we were building the guide, the feedback, very typical feedback, was from organizations that were constantly dealing with incidents that maybe something like Move IT that is being exploited by Clop ransomware, and we need to understand our exposure. And any large enough organization may have different pockets of exposure, and just understanding where and how they exposed, and if they exposed, then quickly deal with that incident, because the time to mitigate that incident matters a lot when a major ransomware actor is actively exploiting that vulnerability in your industry, and you may be next. And so quickly managing that incident is critical. And how do you do that? You need to gather a lot of information about what is vulnerable, which component is vulnerable, who's the vendor, whether it's Progress Software or 3CX or something else. Who's the vendor that is that has the patch, and where that patch is, and how to deploy that patch, or maybe not a patch but something else, some kind of other mitigating actions that you need to do in order to handle that incident quickly and protect your organization from this ransomware. And so that time takes days or even longer for teams to just gather information about their exposure and even communicate with impacted vendor or supplier of this component. Now, in the modern world, right now, most of the organizations are not dealing with one incident. They're dealing with multiple incidents at the same time. So they're dealing with trying to mitigate Move IT. At the same time, they may be dealing with trying to mitigate 3CX exposure or understand their 3CX exposure. At the same time, they're dealing with Citrix bleed if they use NetScaler appliances. At the same time, they may be dealing with fourth major vulnerability or major breach in the supply chain. How do you do that fast and efficiently? I think that's one of the other core principles that we built into the guide, so that you don't have to go into 10 different places and try to gather all that information. You have that information available to you in one place in the guide. And if it's not, then we'll improve. But that's the idea.
Also, I like the proactive approach as well, that moving forward, I can manage my exposure and attack surface by selecting technology that I know has a tighter supply chain, that is more trustworthy than one's more trustworthy than another, right? And I keep coming back to, I don't know how great of an example it is, but I keep going back to the TPM that recently this year was vulnerabilities were disclosed in certain TPM chips. And that TPM vendor was like, oh yeah, we don't support that anymore. And then you go to the OEM that put that TPM chip in thousands, conceivably, of devices, of laptops, servers, whatever. And they go, well, I can't really fix that because I rely on the upstream provider. So now the question becomes, I got to make sure I don't buy new stuff that has that in it because I'm going to increase my attack surface, right? But I also want to know, Yuriy, to your point, where is that stuff in my environment? And if there's no fix right now, the hardware side is much more difficult. To your point, in software, I think it's a lot more fluid. Like, we got better tools, and it's an easier time to mitigate those vulnerabilities. When it's in hardware, it's not as easy. I basically have to replace that hardware to mitigate that vulnerability today, short of having some update for that TPM chip, which does a great deal to provide integrity to my entire system, depending on how it's used.
Yeah, what about that obscure thing, TPM chip, right? That nobody heard about. And yet it's like the foundation for all the trustworthy computing that we have, including all the confidential computing, solutions that we deploy to keep the data processing confidential, protected. And it's like, fundamental to so many security controls we have today.
Right.
And just like you said, a vulnerability in a TPM chip, how's that even possible? It's possible because it runs a very complex firmware that is updated. And it has to be updated when there's a vulnerability, but sometimes it doesn't because manufacturer or supplier doesn't support that model or a version of the chip anymore. That's a chip specifically, but I think that's the level of all of the critical products that we have. Like, earlier this year, I think Barracuda had to or recommended to replace a bunch of these appliances because vulnerabilities in those appliances were actively being exploited and they couldn't be patched. So we're dealing. I think we're going to be dealing with that inability to patch some of the major vulnerabilities more and more.
So this is the problem that we're seeing over and over again, and we're in a position where, people know this can happen. We've seen it happen more than once. What is, I think, troubling is that you might know that there is a problem. You might know where the problem is, what it is in, but the person next to you or the person at this other company who has a similar role, they don't. And there's not a central place to share this and to propagate that information quickly. And so what ends up happening is you watch one organization after another sort of fall over from the same problem. And that's kind of depressing. So, maybe we could do something about that.
Yuriy, I'm curious your take here. So we did the white paper with DigitalOcean, and although that wasn't centered on the guide, this conversation is really making me think that in the context of merger and acquisitions, which right now is on fire across finance, oil and gas, there's not a vertical that's not consolidating right now. And I think it was really profound because not only in that case study, but in another customer that we have, when you go through merger and acquisition, pre and post, on the pre side, if you were able to acquire a company and ask them to run the guide across their inventory, you get X results, and let's just say for round numbers, half of their devices are extremely vulnerable, right? 50% of their 10,000 devices you're about to acquire are really vulnerable. You can use that to negotiate leverage during the M&A process to say, you know what, I can't acquire and integrate that 50% of super vulnerable devices and make some models into my environment. So we're not going to consider that as part of your asset valuation for that set of devices that we just can't handle. And you can tell them, I can't handle it because I can't afford to process, firmware update, and deploy. Our schedule's too fast. You can tell them anything you want to in the negotiation, but at the end of the day, you have now visibility and leverage as part of the M&A process. Or conversely, in the post-merger acquisition, before you choose to bring on all these devices, you might want to know what that posture looks like compared to your current posture to see if there's even relative parity in terms of security posture across two different sets of IT devices that have been managed completely different, maybe come from completely different supply chains, different makes and models, and top tier vendors, HP, Dell, and you can make good decisions about whether or not you want to integrate, or maybe how you integrate, or how you segment, or when you tech refresh. And all these things are super critical, big decisions in the context of M&A. The digital supply chain is one of the primary points of consideration during merger and acquisition these days.
Also, I think a big problem that I've spoken to people in the trenches about this particular problem is merger and acquisition, and they have the vulnerable tech, and the only reason they know now is because it was compromised and there was indicators of that compromise. They go, oh, we have net scalers, we should do something about that. It's too late, right? We want to get ahead of this. Yuriy?
Thanks, Claude and Paul. And I think, when you acquire infrastructure through any means, maybe new infrastructure, or maybe through an acquisition of another business company, it's all part of it all becomes part of your supply chain. It all becomes an entry point into your organization. And I think it is important to understand the risk of that infrastructure, how vulnerable it is, absolutely, and what sort of measures you can take quickly to kind of improve, reduce that risk. Maybe not power up, some of the parts of the infrastructure, or patch it, before you bring it into your larger infrastructure. I think it's important to understand if it's compromised, because you literally can be inheriting an infrastructure which has a threat actor in it, dwelled into it through some kind of a earlier incident or a vulnerability, and just having foothold in that infrastructure, and as a result, you bring that threat actor into your environment. That can have consequences, obviously. So I think it's important to understand both sides, and how vulnerable this infrastructure you're acquiring, but also has it been compromised? Is it a
I really think that's important.
Yeah, but that's a good segue into the platform, our software platform that we have, right? So you have the guide that we talked about. And the way that I use the platform, I'll give like a use case in this context, is to tell me about one thing. It does tell me about things that changed. Like maybe I've inherited infrastructure, or maybe I've got laptops that I know don't get EFI updates. I monitor that. I create a baseline, and I'm like, all right, I know that's there, But tell me if it changes, because like it really shouldn't change, right? Unless I am initiating that change, it shouldn't change. And the platform tells you about that on a continuous monitoring level, which I think is really super important to the context of this conversation.
And in a way, the guide is that intelligence feed that allows us to make those integrity decisions. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, I think the ability to make integrity decisions is maybe the most important thing, or one of the most important things. It turns out that making integrity decisions is actually rather hard. And this is why we're sort of stuck with whatever we have inside of our whatever it is, whether it's a piece of software, mm-hmm. a device, or some component. And we're stuck with whatever that is because we don't know how to check the integrity. So there's an aspect of how verifiable any given thing happens to be. And that is a function of how much you know about what it's supposed to be. That's what the guide kind of does. It gives you this idea of what's supposed to be there. And to the degree that, we even know what's supposed to be there, this is what you can check. If you don't have anything, to check against, that makes it kind of hard.
Right. Running short on time, Yuri, closing thoughts, please.
Wouldn't it be nice if we all adopted this bill of materials, that every vendor and every supplier provides to us, and we have the tools to continuously verify what we are using, the bill of material, real-time bill of material, what we're using, and compare it against the expected bill of material. It would be awesome. I don't know. I think it's a kind of a future desired state of the industry. I don't think we'll get there in the next couple of years, but I think the verification cannot stop at when you acquire a product, new or through acquisition or through some other means, because new vulnerabilities get discovered. New threat actors are compromising software code, firmware code in those every day. We need to understand it all the time. What has changed, what has been altered, what has been infected, what's available from suppliers, vendors that can patch those vulnerabilities, and so on and so forth. So it has to be a continuous assessment to really kind of move the needle in protecting this complex digital supply chain of all those hardware and software products that we have today.
Fantastic. Yuri, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Thank you, Scott and John. That will conclude this episode. We'll see everyone next time.